Hi, this is Sean D'Souza, and you're listening to the 3-Month Vacation Podcast. This podcast isn't some magic trick about how to work less. Instead, it's about how to really enjoy the work that you do and to enjoy your vacation time. Hi, I'm Sean, and you're listening to the 3-Month Vacation. At Heathrow Airport, a plane lands every 45 seconds in rush hour. That volume of traffic is clearly overwhelming, isn't it? Yet day after day, planes land without too much of an incident. We have our own planes, don't we? And sometimes we see ourselves as air traffic control. Yet, to compare ourselves with an air traffic controller is slightly unfair. Their job is incredibly stressful, and yet there are many of them with shifts and all kinds of stuff that we don't have. And they're mostly handling a single task, that of getting the plane down safely. You and I struggle a lot more when it comes to coping with overwhelm. You're barely reading one book when someone sends you a recommendation for 5 more. You're working yourself through a course when some other course seems so much more interesting, so much easier. You start out learning Spanish and you find that your stop-start method isn't working very well at all. At times, it doesn't seem like landing planes, but it seems almost like war has broken out and you're getting battered from every single side. The reality is that we've got to fight this war every day. And while we're never going to win the war, we have to win the smaller battles. This podcast is a rerun from 2018. It's about Overwhelm, and I hope you enjoy it. If you knew someone who had 20 tasks to do versus someone who had 10 tasks or 3 tasks, who do you think would be the most overwhelmed? The answer isn't what you'd expect. The person with the fewest tasks seems to be more overwhelmed. But does that mean that the person with the most number of tasks is less stressed? I woke up this morning after a Sunday siesta, wondering how life had taken me down a weird road. I wasn't supposed to be a marketer. I wasn't supposed to be a person who wrote books, who did seminars, who did webinars. I wasn't supposed to know or to do a lot of the things that I do today. I was a cartoonist, plain and simple. And yet, there was a secret that I mistakenly learned while in the field of cartoons itself. That overwhelm comes from less, not more. What a weird thought, right? And for me to get you back to that point, we have to go back to Mumbai, India, to 2 local newspapers, and then the trip forks around 2003 in Auckland. And this concept plays out again. And today, in 2018, Pinterest and Instagram play another role. And I'm not making any sense, I know, but what's happening is that I'm probably less overwhelmed with more stuff to do. And how is that possible? This doesn't make any sense, does it? You should be more overwhelmed when you have more stuff to do, but it seems like it's the opposite way. And people bring it up all the time, so let's find out more about this factor of overwhelm. The 3 points that we'll cover is the problem of non-planning. The second one is paradoxical in the sense that bigger loads lead to greater efficiency. And the third is how the term itself, using that word overwhelm, how it causes you to be more overwhelmed. Let's start off with the first one, which is about planning. Bad planning or non-existent planning. How does that cause overwhelm? When we go back about 20 years, 25 years ago in Mumbai, India, I was a young cartoonist and I wanted to make a name for myself. I wanted to draw cartoon strips for the newspapers. These were local newspapers. And I looked at all the heroes in the marketing world. No, not marketing world, the cartooning world. And I thought, well, I want to be a cartoonist like them. So I tried to mail the big cartoon syndicates like United Feature Syndicate and King Feature Syndicate. All I ever got from them was a bunch of rejection letters. And then I wrote even to a friend of mine, a pen pal, who then sent my cartoons to San Jose Mercury News. And they very kindly sent me a rejection letter as well. So I decided, okay, that's not working. Instead of going to these big American names, I figured it would be so much easier to get into the dailies in Mumbai itself. Now, these newspapers were Indian, and I thought, okay, my chances are going to be so much better here. I was clearly wrong in my assumption. It wasn't that Indian newspapers didn't publish cartoons. If anything, every newspaper had over 10 comic strips on a daily basis. However, what I didn't know at that time was those comic strips were being dumped at rock-bottom prices into India and many other countries. I, on the other hand, wanted to be paid at least a moderately good fee just to do that work because it cost money and time. Now, the editors were getting those comics at a cheap rate, and it made sense for them to use it. But I was persistent, and I kept bugging 2 editors of 2 separate newspapers to accept my cartoons, even pitching 2 separate comic strips to them. And one was called Mumbai Meri Jaan, which means Mumbai My Life, and the other one was Sultanates, which is about a sultan, a king, an emperor who's crazy. But no matter how much I pitched, all I got was rejection. And then, out of the blue, both the editors changed their mind. I can't remember the exact sequence, but I do know that I suddenly had 2 editors giving me the green light. So my plan for getting published had gone too well. I had to draw a daily comic strip for 2 newspapers 5 times a week. I'd gone from having to do 0 comic strips to 10 of them every single week. I found the experience to be a lot like the 30-day drawing or writing challenges that you see online. So a person isn't doing too much, they're not doing much drawing, they're not doing much writing, and then some challenge pops up online. And then this very same person turns out 150,000 words that month, or draws every single day. Even the ones that don't quite stick to the pace, they still put in quite a lot of work. But wait a second, don't these people have a life? How come they suddenly have time to do a cartoon every day or to write a couple of thousand words? The answer lies in the last place that you're looking. You might think that the answer lies in ability, yet that's not it. When people do these challenges, the ability levels are all over the place. Some of them have exceedingly good work. Some of them have yet to catch up with that level of quality. But whether the work is good or rudimentary, they're all there. They're all plowing ahead. The ones that are on track have one ace up their sleeve, and it's called planning. When faced with having to draw 10 comic strips a week, you can't just sit down to draw. Your brain is fried with the thought of having to create such a high volume of work on a constant basis. And so the only way forward is to sit down and to work out a plan. And that's precisely what I had to do. Without the plan, I couldn't draw 10 comic strips a week. I would be floundering. So to get those cartoons in day after day, without missing or skipping any deadline, I had to make a plan. Time and time again, the people who are overwhelmed will almost not have that plan. They will always have excuses for not having a plan. Or the plan will be a plan, but then there's not enough buffer in it, not enough chaos in that plan. So let's take an example of just getting a book. So we'll get a book from the library or we'll buy a book online, and we have no plan for it. We intend to read it, but we don't have a plan. So when are we going to read it? When we have the time, right? And this is the whole problem. Whether it's cooking a meal or reading a book or doing anything, you have to have all the plans in place, or the plan in place, the ingredients in place. Because if you say, well, I'm going to do this sometime after work, then it just goes to the root of overwhelm. You will always find yourself struggling because overwhelm comes from lack of planning. And once you get down to planning, you realize it's a bit like being on the road. You may have a plan to get to your destination. You've got in your car, and yet when you started driving, things start to change. There might be too much traffic on the road. There might be an accident up ahead. And then there are all those lousy drivers. Every lousy driver seems to have shown up on the road at the exact point that you started on your journey. And when we get started on any project, we realize that plans evolve. To finish 30 cartoons in a month or to write thousands of words, we have to tweak our plans. We have to sometimes overhaul our plans. Even so, a plan should have the following elements. First, the time, the place, and the third are the ingredients required. Let's face it, we're all distracted. We're all distracted with the volume of information that keeps pummeling our brains. Even so, you'll find that more things fall in place when you have that plan, and hope is not a strategy. And one of the best ways to get the plan going is to tag them along with the tasks that you do on a repetitive basis. So what does this mean? For instance, every day I make breakfast, and we make a hot breakfast. And before I turn on the gas to make that dosa, I perch my iPhone on the window. And then I switch on the course that I'm following. Right now I'm doing some courses in Masterclass. I'm watching different people from like all different fields. They're not related to marketing. For instance, I'm watching something by Ron Howard on directing. No, I don't intend to do any movies, but you learn from other fields. And so I'll put it there on the window. And for the next 10 to 15 minutes, I'm listening and I'm cooking breakfast. Then after breakfast, I'll sit for 20 to 30 minutes to paint my watercolor diary. And this is connected to the breakfast. So it's before breakfast and after breakfast. And most people who get things done, most people who are extremely productive have this kind of routine. You might say, I'm too busy before breakfast and after breakfast to do something so mundane. But the point is that the most productive people always have this kind of system in place. They have a routine. They have a plan, then they have a routine. And the people who are overwhelmed almost never have the plan. They have no routine. So it's not consistent. It's not a habit. It's a routine. It's something that leads to something else. And you can check this out for yourself. Go and meet the most productive person that you know, and you will find that they have both of these elements in place, plans and routines. Find someone who is overwhelmed and someone who's overwhelmed all the time, and they'll tell you that they have plans and routines, but often they don't have them at all. And when you expose them, they complain that they have no time to plan. And that's the problem, because you go downhill from there. A plan needs to exist, and a routine needs to exist, and you have to keep tweaking that plan and routine. Well, you keep tweaking the plan and the routine takes care of itself. But otherwise, nothing happens. And one of the biggest upsides of planning is that it shows you when you're doing too much. So let's say you have to do some cartoons and you have to write and then you have to learn Spanish and you have to do a whole bunch of things. And when you plan, you realize, I don't have time to do all of this stuff. So when we don't plan, we think, okay, we'll do all this stuff. But the moment you plan, you find that you are able to estimate, not exactly, it's an estimate, but you are much better off than if you just decide, okay, I'm going to do all this stuff. And that's the first thing that most people who are very productive have. They have this planning system in place. But the second thing that they have is something called fluency. It's not talent, it's fluency. That's the second part of today's episode. Let's find out what it is. Ever since I got the iPad Pro, I've been besotted with this program called Procreate. Now, Procreate is a drawing app, and I'm a cartoonist, and most people think, well, you're already talented and you already can draw great cartoons, so what could go wrong? A lot could go wrong. Procreate is a program. It has its own shortcuts, it has its own features, and when you start working with any software, it's like entering a new world. There are too many buttons, too many features, and you stick with the stuff that's easy to understand. So a month passes, 2 months pass, possibly years, and you're still in the comfort zone. Except it's not a comfort zone at all. Take, for instance, some of the stuff that I was doing. So when you create a cartoon, you have to draw it in 2 layers, and there's a reason for this. The first layer often tends to be the outline layer, which is in black. The second layer, that's the color layer, and that sits below the outline layer. So from day one, I was drawing the outline and then laboriously putting in the color in the second layer. In short, I wasn't using the features of Procreate like they were meant to be used, and I was doubling my effort and getting worse results. Well, not worse results, but it was taking me more time. Now, look at all the work that you're doing, and you can be sure that you are wasting enormous amounts of time. Let's take the simple act of trying to type out your address. If someone asked you to give your mailing address, would it take you 2 seconds or a few minutes? If you wanted to find a folder buried deep down, what would you do? Could you get it in 1 click or in 17 clicks? The difference between people who get a lot of stuff done versus those who struggle is merely the lack of fluency. Now, you may call it talent, but it's fluency. No one is born to find folders buried 17 layers down, and no one that we know is born with the talent to type out their address in 2 seconds. All of this speed is achieved through the power of fluency. You and I have technology at our disposal, but we choose to do things as we did on day 1 or day 2. So we say we know this program, we've been using this program, and then we fail to learn how new shortcuts work because, of course, we're busy. So now we fail to implement new features because we have a life, and then this leads to a lack of fluency and leads to a drain of energy. And once your energy is drained, you've reached your state of overwhelm. However, it's not just technology that's at play. Skills like writing and drawing and cooking, they can all be fine-tuned so that you can get the job done at great speed. You could write a sales page in 3 days flat, or you could spend 2 weeks doing it. You could get a high-quality article done in 90 minutes, or you could take a few days. Skills are not about being hit by a bolt of lightning or being born with some kind of inborn talent. What they are is a factor of fluency. What you need to do is have these tiny increments of fluency day by day, week by week, month by month. The people who are overwhelmed take the longer route. The way to get away from that overwhelming feeling is to ask yourself, how can I do this task in X minutes or X hours? And the answer isn't as weird as you believe. In reality, most of us, we can reduce the number of hours that we spend on lots of tasks, and we can do it quite dramatically. But we have to ask the question, it seems impossible. How can I do this in half the time? How can I do this in 3/4 of the time? How can I do this? It's a factor of time. And it's not just time, because the more time we spend, the more energy we use. The more energy we use, the more tired we feel. And you know where this is going. There's no end point there. It just gets worse and worse. So try it for yourself. Reach for that folder right now. If you're sitting at your computer, or if you get to your computer, reach for that folder, deep, deep, deep down, 17 layers down. Can you do it? Can you do it in 1 second? If not, then you are at the gates of Overwhelm. It's always a factor of fluency, of finding a method, a system that will get you there quicker and better. And this is what great writers, great cartoonists, great chefs, great whatever skill you want to take, this is what they do consistently. They look at not just speed, but they look at how we can get better in less time. Because once you get that way, then, well, there's no overwhelm, is it? And this takes us to our third part, which is using the word overwhelm. Now, we're in the year 2018, and I'm reading from the New Yorker, and this is a story by Joshua Rothman. And Joshua wrote this article, and he says that last year, the Pew Research Center asked people around the world whether life had been better or worse in their countries 50 years ago. And a slim bunch of Americans thought that life had been better. In 1967, the United States was fighting the Vietnam War. Protest marches were taking place through the country. Crime was surging, and race riots were breaking out through Detroit, Newark, Milwaukee, other cities. In that spring, a wave of tornadoes injured thousands across the Midwest. Members of the Black Panther Party were carrying shotguns and rifles. They marched into California State House. They protested at racially motivated gun control law. In June, the Six-Day War broke out. You know what I'm saying here, right? I'm saying that life was not better. People lived in smaller houses, ate less food, ate worse food, worked more hours, and on average died 7 years earlier. But if you were to ask someone, was life better back then, 50 years ago? And almost without a doubt, they will say that. They will say that life was slower, better paced, there was less trouble back then. They call that the good old days. And not one of us wants to go back to the good old days. Because if we were back in those good old days, we would have been completely overwhelmed. And this is one of the problems that we have today, is that people always think that they are worse off today in many ways, and life is so much more difficult now than before. And so they use this word overwhelm all the time. And researchers found that if you continue to say something on a regular basis, it becomes a reality. It becomes a reality for you and for everybody around you. There's also a very subtle difference between the way adults speak and the way kids speak. When kids can't manage stuff, what kind of words do they use? They use words like afraid or scared. Not one kid you know is overwhelmed. They're just scared, they're afraid, they're unsure. Now, what if you and I used the same language? What if you were afraid of Photoshop? What if you were scared of WordPress? What if you weren't sure of how to cook a dish to perfection? Almost immediately, your frame of reference changes, doesn't it? Instead, You and I want to be super macho, and so we use big words like overwhelm. It's likely that if you use the word overwhelm, that alone will depress you, probably kill you. The way out of overwhelm is not exactly easy, but it does start with a word change. Fear, scared, afraid, that's a good start. And once you've accepted your fear, you can try and overcome that fear with steps. Tiny steps, little steps that you can take all the time, and then that takes you to this factor of fluency. Now, technology is on our side, and even seemingly difficult tasks like writing and drawing and a lot of tasks that we do as business people is just a matter of finding the right teacher. The right teacher has a good system, they have good groups, and as a result, you start to get these skills, you start to acquire these skills, you start to get fluency, you're able to do stuff in a much better way. But it does start with a change in language. If you use the word overwhelm, there's a pretty good chance that's the way you'll stay. When I started out in psychotactics, I didn't know that much about marketing. And going back in time, I didn't know much about computers or Photoshop. And when Renuka and I just got married, I would go to a Photoshop class in the city and Corel Draw, and then I would reach home very late at night, sometimes 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock. Then I would have dinner, go to sleep. And at the time, it was overwhelming. It would be so hard to unwind when you got home that late at night. But today, we're able to use those Photoshop skills, those computer skills, and all of the skills. And it is a matter of getting to fluency. And yes, in the short term, there is going to be a sort of overwhelm. We find that when we teach a course like article writing or cartooning, when we introduce a new concept at the start of the week, almost everyone goes backwards. You would think that it's logical to always go forwards, but no, that's not how the brain works. When you're tasked with something new, you have to think about it, you have to process it, and so the brain goes backwards. And then by the end of the week, they tend to go faster, and maybe not. Sometimes it takes 2 weeks to get there and sometimes 3 weeks. But this whole factor of fluency, that's what gets people to the end of anything. They have to get that level of fluency. And to get that level of fluency, someone has to plan for them. In a course, we would be doing the planning, the syllabus, the assignments and stuff. On your own, you have to do your planning. So what really seems like this very simple idea, which is avoid using the word overwhelm. Secondly, make sure that you get to fluency somehow. Don't necessarily believe that you were born to do stuff or not born to do stuff, and that you have this inborn talent or don't have it. You find the right teacher, it's amazing what you can do. And finally, the teacher has to have a plan or you have to have a plan, but there has to be a plan in place. And that's precisely what we covered on today's podcast. So what's the one thing that you can do today? I think the one thing that all of us can do today is to stop using the word overwhelm. It seems like a really pathetic thing to do, but let's not use the word overwhelm. Let's do the word afraid or scared or unsure, and it's amazing what we can do from there. There is also a second thing that you might want to do, and look at the stuff that you're doing and say, how can I cut this down by 30% or 25% or 10%? How can you do that? How can you stop and think, well, is there a better way to do this quicker? Just like I did with Procreate, I was just wasting time fiddling around with those 2 layers. How can you do something? Can you learn some shortcuts? Is there something that you can do to do it better and faster at the same time? That's the thing that you can do. And that brings us to the end of this podcast. Let's find out what's happening in psychotactics land. So what's happening in psychotactics land? Well, we are in January of 2020, And on the 25th of Jan, we have the Info Products self-study, only 25 copies. You probably know we only sell a limited number, even though they're digital. We could sell 100 of them, but we choose to sell just 25. If you're not in the waiting list, you won't hear from us. So you have to go to psychotactics.com/info goodies, and you'll get the goodies, but you also get on the waiting list. The article writing course is coming up in March as well, the live one as well as the self-study. Keep your eyes open for it. You'll hear announcements on the podcast and you'll see it on the newsletter, but that's coming up in March. And yes, we'll see you in 5000 BC. You know that it's a place where introverts meet and we talk about stuff, and it's a slow, organic process. Instead of just trying to work out everything like you've done in the years gone by, you can get help, and I think you should take it. So that's 5000bc.com. That's me, Sean D'Souza, saying bye for now. Bye-bye.